On March 31, 1909, a single steel plate was lowered into a Belfast shipyard, and the most famous ship in history began to exist. Tonight follows her from that cold morning to the deep, still ocean floor where she has rested for more than a century. Belfast, in 1909, was one of the most industrially active cities in the British Isles, and on a spring morning it was loud before it was fully light. The Harland and Wolff shipyard on Queen's Island was never quiet. The clang of hammers, the hiss of steam, the rumble of cranes moving across iron rails, all of it started early and ran until the light went. At the peak of construction on the ship that had just received its first keel plate, the workforce would swell to 15,000 people, their footsteps filling the cobbled streets of East Belfast in the dark before the city was fully awake. The man most responsible for what was being built was a 35-year-old naval architect named Thomas Andrews. He was the managing director of the drafting department at Harland and Wolff, the nephew of the shipyard's chairman, Lord Pirrie, and the person who had overseen the design of the ship from its earliest drawings. Andrews was known among his workers as someone who walked the decks of every ship he built, rather than sitting at a desk while others did the physical work. He would later board the ship for its maiden voyage, as he did with every vessel before delivery, carrying a small notebook in which he wrote down everything that could be improved. He cared about the ships as if they were his own. The ship given yard number 401 was the second of 3 Olympic-class ocean liners being built for the White Star Line. Her sister ship, yard number 400, had her keel laid 3 months earlier, in December 1908. They were being built simultaneously on adjacent slipways at the Queen's Yard, which had been entirely rebuilt to accommodate them. The original 4 slipways at the yard had been demolished and replaced with 2 larger ones, because no existing slipway in the world was large enough to hold both ships. This reconstruction alone cost £100,000 before a single plate of either vessel had been laid. What made the scale of the project visible from across the harbour was the Arrol gantry. This was the steel framework that rose above the slipways to allow construction at every level of the ship simultaneously, and it had been built by Sir William Arrol and Company, the same Scottish engineering firm responsible for the Forth Bridge and London's Tower Bridge. The gantry stood 228 feet tall, 270 feet wide, and 840 feet deep from front to back. It weighed more than 6,000 tons. It was, at the time of its construction, the largest structure ever built specifically to construct a ship. Workers moved through it on cranes and hoists and ladders, fixing steel plates and frames at every height at once. From across Belfast Lough, it dominated the skyline like a cathedral made of iron. Beneath that gantry, on Slipway 3, the keel plate of yard number 401 was set in place on March 31st, 1909. The keel is the spine of a ship, the lowest structural element from which everything else rises. A single plate does not look like much. It weighs several tons and lies flat against the slipway blocks, and standing beside it on that spring morning, you would have had no particular sense of what it would eventually become. It would be 26 months before the hull that grew from that plate was finished. It would be nearly 3 years before the completed ship first sailed with passengers aboard. What was accumulating above that keel plate, frame by frame and plate by plate, across 2 full years of Belfast weather, was a ship 882.5 feet long, 92 feet wide, with a gross tonnage of 46,328 tons. 3 million rivets would hold her hull together. 29 boilers and 159 furnaces would drive her through the North Atlantic at approximately 22 knots. Her 4 funnels would rise 62 feet above the boat deck. 3 of those funnels were functional. The 4th was added because it made the ship look more powerful, and sometimes what a thing looks like matters as much as what it can do. None of the men laying those first plates knew what was coming, not the riveters walking to the yard in the dark, not Thomas Andrews with his notebook, not the chairman of the White Star Line who had approved the designs the year before over a dinner with Lord Pirrie, and who could not yet imagine what the name of this ship would eventually mean to the world. The keel plate was down. The gantry rose over it. The work had begun. If you are settling in for tonight, this is the first chapter of a long and quiet journey through one of the most extraordinary stories the sea has ever held. There are 19 more chapters ahead. None of them need to be hurried. We will follow this ship from here all the way to where she rests now. And the place where she rests is, as it turns out, surprisingly peaceful. 3,000 of the 15,000 workers at Harland and Wolff were directly involved in building the Titanic. The rest built other vessels, maintained the yard, or kept the complex moving. But on Slipway 3, across 2 full years, those 3,000 men arrived before light and left after dark. And the work they did was physical, in ways that left permanent marks on the body. The most basic unit of ship construction at that time was the riveting gang. Each gang consisted of 4 people working together to fix a single rivet. The first was the heater boy, typically the youngest member of the team, who heated iron or steel rivets in a small portable furnace until they glowed orange. When a rivet was ready, he picked it out with long tongs and threw it upward to the second person, the catcher, standing on the hull above with a leather cup. The catcher handed it to the third person, the holder-on, who braced a dolly bar against one end of the rivet from inside the hull. Then the riveter, the most senior member, hammered the protruding end with a heavy hammer until it spread and locked the plates together. 4 people, 1 rivet, repeated roughly 200 times each day in dry weather. Over the course of construction, approximately 3 million rivets were driven into the Titanic's hull by gangs working in exactly this pattern. 3 million is not an abstract number. It represents every dry day, every clear morning, every afternoon when the rain held off and the work could continue at full pace across 2 Belfast winters and 2 Belfast springs. The records from the construction list: 246 injuries, 28 classified as severe, including arms taken by machinery and legs crushed under falling steel. 8 workers died during the construction and fitting out of the entire ship. One of them killed just before the launch when a piece of timber fell from the gantry above him. These were not strangers to one another. The shipyard was a community. Most of the workers lived within walking distance of each other in the terraced streets of East Belfast, and the men who worked the plates and the frames and the rivet fires had grown up in the same neighborhoods, attended the same churches, and buried their dead in the same cemeteries. When someone was killed, the grief was personal and immediate. What they were building, even to people accustomed to large ships, was extraordinary. The workers on Slipway 3 had a loyalty to yard number 401 that the men on the adjacent slipway, working on the Olympic, did not share. Their ship, their plates, their 3 million rivets. The hull rising above Slipway 3 was longer than any previous ship and heavier than anything Harland and Wolff had produced. And as the months passed and the steel climbed upward through the gantry's scaffolding, the ship became visible from across the city in a way that made passers-by stop and look. The anchor, when it arrived, required 20 Clydesdale draft horses to haul it just 2 miles by wagon from the forge shop to the nearest railway station. The head of the center anchor weighed nearly 16 tons. The shank weighed another 8. This was an anchor for a ship that could not be moved by anything smaller than a fleet of horses, and even then, only the anchor, not the chain, not the machinery, not the 30 boilers that would eventually fill the lower decks. Most of those boilers were still being manufactured in the autumn of 1910, when the hull's basic steel skeleton was approaching completion. The frames that defined the internal shape of the ship were in place. The watertight bulkheads that divided the hull into 16 separate compartments had been fitted. The plates that formed the outer skin had been riveted in sequence from the keel upward, and what remained visible from Slipway 3 was no longer a skeleton, but an enclosed hull, vast and dark and silent inside, waiting for everything that would make it habitable. The workers who would do that next phase of work were different craftsmen. The riveters and platers were the rough trades. What came after required carpenters, upholsterers, tilers, painters, electricians, plumbers, and glaziers. The people who would build the interior of a ship that was being designed to feel nothing like the exterior of one. But that work was still ahead. In early 1911, with the hull approaching readiness for launch, the men who had built her bones were finishing their part of the project. They had spent 2 years turning drawings into steel, and the ship they had made was ready to meet the harbour it had been built beside for its entire existence. The bones were done. The city of Belfast was about to see the result of all that work all at once, in 62 seconds. The hull of the Titanic grew into view slowly enough that the people of Belfast adjusted to it, and then all at once it was simply enormous and had always been so. From the outside, what was visible from across the harbour was a wall of steel rising inside the Aral gantry, gaining height month by month. From the inside, what the workers saw was more intricate. The ship's internal structure was a system of steel frames and bulkheads that had to be built before a single exterior plate could be laid, because the strength of a ship comes from its bones, not its skin. 15 watertight bulkheads divided the hull into 16 separate compartments, and the doors between those compartments could be closed remotely from the bridge using a switch that activated electromagnetic releases. The designers had given the ship this feature deliberately. It was considered an advanced safety system for 1911, and it contributed to the ship's reputation, widely held in the press and the shipping industry, as a vessel that was, in a practical engineering sense, very difficult to sink. Philson Young, an Irish journalist who visited the shipyard during construction, wrote that the emerging hull was a ship so monstrous and unthinkable that it towered there over the buildings and dwarfed the very mountains by the water. The image he was reaching for was of something that did not seem to belong to the scale of ordinary things. A ship that had crossed some threshold in size where it stopped being a very large ship and started being something else, a geographic feature that happened to float. The dimensions that justified that description: 882.5 feet long, 92.5 feet wide at the broadest point. The hull alone, without funnels or superstructure, rose to a height of about 60 feet from the keel to the boat deck. The completed ship would weigh approximately 52,000 tons when loaded. She was longer than the Cunard liner Mauretania, longer than any ship then afloat, and her construction had required modifications to the harbour itself to ensure she could pass through Belfast Lough without grounding. Not all of the funnels visible in the ship's early photographs were what they appeared to be. Thomas Andrews had originally designed the ship with 3 functional funnels, which was the number required to vent the boilers. A 4th funnel was added during the design process because 4 funnels was a visual shorthand for power and speed in the ocean liner trade of that era. Passengers associated more funnels with more capability, and the White Star Line was competing directly with Cunard, whose Mauretania and Lusitania had 4. The 4th funnel on the Titanic was therefore built, fitted, and painted to match the others. It served as a ventilation shaft for the kitchens. No smoke came from it. Every image of the Titanic that shows 4 equal funnels shows one that was, in a precise sense, a very expensive piece of scenery. The propulsion system that actually moved the ship was more straightforward. 3 propellers, 2 outer wing propellers, each 23.5 feet in diameter, and 1 center propeller, slightly smaller at 16.5 feet. The outer 2 were driven by the ship's 2 main reciprocating steam engines. The center propeller was driven by a low-pressure turbine. Together, these produced approximately 46,000 shaft horsepower and a service speed on the maiden voyage of roughly 21 to 22 knots. By May 1911, 26 months after the keel plate went down, the hull was complete. The exterior skin was fully plated, the interior frames and bulkheads were in place, and the enormous steel shell had been inspected and signed off. It contained nothing yet. No boilers, no engines, no furnishings, no people. Just steel and rivets and the hollow interior where all of that would eventually go. The shape of a ship, but not yet a ship in any operational sense. What it was, on the morning of May 31st, 1911, was a hull ready to be launched. 100,000 people came to the harbour to watch it happen. There was no champagne. The White Star Line had never christened a ship, and they saw no reason to start. The hull would slide down into the harbour as the Olympic had slid down the previous October, on greased slipways coated with tallow, soap, and train oil. It would not be a ceremony in the traditional sense. It would be an engineering event, a hull being transferred from land to water, watched by 100,000 people in the cold spring air of Belfast, who had gathered to see the largest moving object ever built by human hands enter the water for the first time. The slipways were greased, the crowd was gathered, the bolts that held the ship to the slipway were cut, and after 26 months of construction, the hull began to move. The hull moved slowly at first, then faster, then very fast, and in 62 seconds it was gone from the slipway and in the water, and 100,000 people made a sound that carried across the harbour. May 31, 1911, was a clear morning in Belfast, which was fortunate because over 100,000 people had come to watch. They stood on every available vantage point, the docks, the far bank of the lough, the rooftops of buildings with a sight line to the slipway. They had come by foot and by tram and by special excursion trains from across Ireland and Britain. The launch of the world's largest ship was an event that did not have an obvious equivalent in ordinary life, and people who had grown up watching the Harland and Wolff Yard from across the water had waited 2 years for this particular morning. The slipways had been prepared the night before. The launch required the entire underside of the keel and the slipway cradle to be lubricated so thoroughly that the hull could slide forward under gravity without sticking. The crew had applied approximately 23 tons of tallow, soap, and train oil across the bearing surfaces. This was the engineering solution to a problem that had not existed at this scale before: how to move 50,000 tons of steel from land to water in a controlled way, using no power source other than the gradient of the slipway and the weight of the hull itself. Thomas Andrews was there. Lord Pirrie was there. J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, was there. Representatives of the Board of Trade were there to certify that the launch met regulatory requirements. The photographers were there. The crowd was so large that management of the spectators alone was a significant organizational challenge. There was no champagne. There was no naming ceremony. The White Star Line's tradition was to launch their ships without christening, and they applied that tradition to the Titanic, as they had to every vessel before it. No bottle was broken, no name was spoken over the hull. The ship that would become known to every generation that followed slid into the water of Belfast Lough without a word said in its honour, accompanied only by the mechanical sound of the slipway and the crowd's response when it hit the water. The hull entered the Victoria Channel at approximately 12:14 in the afternoon. Hydraulic rams had been used to start the movement, and once it began, the hull accelerated down the slipway under its own weight. Drag chains and anchor cables were attached to slow the hull before it reached the far bank of the channel, because without them, the momentum of 50,000 tons of steel moving at speed would have carried the hull into the opposite shore. The chains did their job. The hull came to rest in the channel, riding high in the water because it carried almost none of its eventual weight in contents, and tugs moved in immediately to secure it and begin towing it the short distance to the fitting-out wharf where the next stage of work would take place. The entire event, from the first movement of the hull to its arrival in the channel, lasted 62 seconds. What the crowd had just watched was not yet a ship. It was a hull, a steel shell with no engines, no boilers, no funnels, no decks, no furnishings, no anything that would make it useful or habitable. The structure was complete, but the substance was entirely absent. The inside of what had just entered the water was a cavernous, empty, echoing space. The work of filling it would take another 10 months and involve a second wave of craftsmen whose skills were entirely different from the riveters and platers who had built the bones. The sister ship Olympic had been launched 7 months earlier in October 1910, and by the time Titanic entered the water in May 1911, Olympic was already completing her sea trials and preparing for her own maiden voyage just 2 weeks away. The two ships had been born 3 months apart and would grow up simultaneously. And if you stood on the fitting-out wharf in June 1911 and looked at the bare hull of the Titanic, the only way to distinguish it from a large, empty, industrial building was the fact that it was floating. The builders began boarding almost immediately. The second phase of the project was underway, and what happened inside that hull over the next 10 months would make it one of the most discussed interiors in the history of architecture, even though it was designed to be experienced rather than studied, and would spend less than 5 full days in service before everything changed. The fitting out had begun. The rooms were about to be made. The craftsmen who came aboard after the launch were not the same men who had built the hull. The riveters and platers worked in iron and steel at a scale where individual components weighed tons. What was needed now were people who worked in wood and fabric and tile and glass, who measured in inches rather than feet, and whose work would be seen not from across a harbour, but from a distance of 3 feet, by passengers running their hands along panelling and settling into chairs, and looking up at ceilings in rooms that had been designed to feel nothing like the interior of a ship. The specification for the first-class staterooms and public rooms was for 11 distinct historical styles. Passengers moving through the first-class areas of the Titanic would pass through spaces modelled after an English country manor in the Georgian style, then through rooms in the Louis XVI style of 18th century France, then through something influenced by the Italian Renaissance, and then through a Jacobean dining room larger than any room most of them had ever eaten in. Each historical period had been researched with enough care that the furniture, the ceiling mouldings, the wall panelling, and the upholstery fabrics all corresponded to the same era. The goal was not novelty. The goal was the suspension of the awareness that you were at sea. Almost all of the woodwork, furniture, and upholstery was produced in Harland and Wolff's own workshops on the shipyard grounds. The craftsmen who built the grand staircase were employees of the same company that had driven the rivets. What distinguished them was specialization. The joiners and cabinet makers who worked the polished oak panels of the staircase's landings spent weeks on sections of the work that would be seen by passengers for less than a minute in passing. The carved details on the banister brackets, the turned wooden columns, the fitted mouldings that met the ceiling at the uppermost landing, all of this was made by hand, in workshops where the standard of work was held to the same level as the finest private commissions available in London or Edinburgh. The staircase itself descended through 6 full decks, from the boat deck at the top to E-deck below. The uppermost landing featured a large ornamental clock flanked by figures representing honor and glory crowning time, carved from the same polished oak as the surrounding paneling. The dome above it was glazed, providing natural daylight at any hour of the day and giving the upper landing the quality of a room that was both enclosed and open. The 3 electric passenger elevators, manufactured by the Otis Elevator Company, were installed alongside the staircase. They were finished in dark wood paneling and upholstered seating, so that the act of traveling between decks on the Titanic resembled a brief stay in a very small, very well-appointed room. Elevators on a ship were not common in 1912. 3 of them, for a single class of passengers, was unusual enough to be mentioned in the ship's promotional literature as a feature worth noting. The Turkish baths occupied a suite of rooms on F deck, decorated in tiles, designed to evoke the Moorish bathhouses of North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. The portholes of the cooling room were fitted with carved wooden screens in an Arabic pattern, so that when light came through from outside, it fell across the tiled floor in geometric shapes that changed with the time of day. The effect was that passengers lying in the cooling room after a steam bath were lying in a room that felt nothing like the North Atlantic. This was entirely intentional. The swimming pool on the same deck was a saltwater pool, 30 feet long and 14 feet wide, one of the first heated swimming pools installed on any ocean liner. The floors around it were tiled in blue and white. A marble stair descended into the water at the shallow end. When the ship was at sea, cold water from the ocean was pumped in alongside the heated water from a tank, maintaining a temperature that encouraged use without becoming comfortable enough to stay in indefinitely. The pool cost 1 shilling to use and was open to first-class passengers during specified hours by gender. Before 8 in the morning, it was free and open to men. Across 10 months, the workers who came aboard each morning transformed the bare steel interior of the hull into a floating building that contained its own restaurant, library, gymnasium, post office, darkroom, barbershop, squash court, swimming pool, and spa, as well as dining rooms, reading rooms, smoking rooms, and hundreds of cabins ranging from utilitarian berths for third-class passengers to private suites with their own promenade decks, 50 feet long, reserved for one family. By late March 1912, the rooms were done. The boilers were in place. The engines had been tested. The Titanic left Belfast for Southampton on April 2nd, after completing her sea trials in Belfast Lough and the Irish Sea, where she had demonstrated that she could stop from full speed in approximately 850 yards and that all her systems functioned as designed. She was ready for the passengers she had been built to carry. They were ready too, in Southampton, Cherbourg, and Queenstown, waiting for the ship whose rooms they had read about in the newspapers and whose departure they had been planning for months. The first thing a first-class passenger encountered upon boarding was the grand staircase, and the grand staircase was designed to produce a specific effect: the immediate and certain understanding that you were not aboard an ordinary ship. The staircase descended 6 decks. Its banisters were made of wrought iron worked into a flowing pattern, and the walls and landings around it were panelled in polished oak. The clock on the uppermost landing, flanked by carved figures representing honour and glory crowning time, was set into a panel of the same oak, and the glass dome above flooded the uppermost landing with light that made the whole structure glow even at night, when the dome lit from below. Passengers standing at the top of the staircase and looking down through the landings had the experience, documented in more than one survivor account, of being inside an extremely grand hotel and feeling momentarily uncertain how they had arrived there. The first-class dining saloon was 114 feet long and extended the full width of the ship. It seated 532 passengers and was the largest dining room installed on any ship up to that time. The ceiling was low and white, the style was Jacobean, and the chairs and tables were oak, designed to stay solid and grounded in rough weather. Long windows down both sides of the room were fitted with leaded glass that diffused the light, and the total effect in the evening was of a room that could plausibly have been in a large English country house if the slight movement of the floor beneath the feet had not reminded passengers, occasionally, where they actually were. Those passengers who preferred something less formal could go to the Café Parisien, a room on B deck designed to feel like a sunlit terrace café in central Paris. It had French trellis work along the walls, climbing plants that would mature over the course of the crossing, small round tables surrounded by wicker chairs, and a floor pattern in white and dark tile. The menu was not different from the main restaurant, but the atmosphere was, and passengers who had been to the actual boulevard cafes of Paris reported that the resemblance was accurate enough to be amusing. The gymnasium was on the boat deck, open to first-class passengers during specified hours that were divided by gender. It contained stationary bicycles, a rowing machine, dumbbells, a punching bag, and two mechanical devices that were unusual enough to be mentioned specifically in newspaper descriptions of the ship before she sailed: a mechanical horse and a mechanical camel, both of which moved in approximate simulation of the animals they represented and were intended to provide the rider with an exercise equivalent to riding. Thomas Macaulay, the gymnasium steward, was available to guide passengers through the equipment and sold access at 1 shilling per session. He did not survive the sinking. The Turkish baths were on F deck. Passengers moved through a sequence of rooms of different temperatures: the hot room, the temperate room, the cooling room, and the shampoo rooms. The cooling room was decorated in Moorish tiles with Arabic-patterned wooden screens across the portholes, and the light that came through those screens fell on the tiled floor in geometric patterns that changed through the day. The electric baths offered a different treatment, a form of electrotherapy that was fashionable in Edwardian medicine and that has no modern equivalent, involving mild electrical current applied through the bath water. Attendants were available throughout. The cost was $1, then approximately equivalent to a skilled worker's daily wage. The heated saltwater swimming pool was across the corridor from the baths. At 30 feet long and 14 feet wide, it was modest, but novelty for an ocean crossing was the point, not size. The blue and white tile floor, the marble stair into the water, the changing cubicles along one wall, these were features that most passengers would not have encountered on a ship before. The first class had its own library, its own reading and writing room, its own smoking room panelled in Georgian mahogany, and its own reception room where passengers gathered before dinner to discuss the day's crossing. Third-class passengers on the Titanic had none of these amenities, but what they had was still, by the standards of the industry in 1912, considered generously above average. Their cabins were enclosed individual rooms rather than open dormitories. They had indoor toilet facilities, electric light, and central heating. Their dining room served 3 full sittings per meal. The general room, where third-class passengers gathered in the evenings to talk and play music, was panelled in pine and finished in white enamel. Survivors who had travelled third class on other ships of the era noted that the accommodation compared favourably with second class on competitors' vessels. The ship contained 840 rooms across all classes. She had carried 3,547 people at design capacity, though on her maiden voyage she would carry fewer than that. What she provided for all of them, for the wealthiest passenger in the private promenade suite and for the emigrant in a 4-berth third-class cabin, was the same fundamental thing: a bed, a meal, and a passage across 3,000 miles of open ocean. The passengers who would fill those rooms were already on their way to Southampton. The 2,224 people who boarded the Titanic across her 3 embarkation ports came from more than 30 countries and represented nearly every economic circumstance then available to a person traveling by ship across the North Atlantic. The 324 passengers in first class included wealthy industrialists, aristocrats, financiers, and members of the international social class that moved between country houses and city apartments on both sides of the Atlantic, traveling with large amounts of luggage and often with servants. The wealthiest among them occupied the parlour suites on B and C decks, which included private promenade decks 50 feet long, accessible only to the suite's occupants, at a cost of £870 for the crossing, roughly equivalent to what a skilled dock worker in Belfast would earn in 2 years of labour. The 284 passengers in second class were professionals, academics, clergy, small business owners, and middle-class families. The Titanic's second-class accommodations were, by the standards of the industry, comparable to or better than first-class travel on many other ships, and several passengers in second class had specifically chosen it over first class for this voyage after making the comparison. The second-class library was stocked with books. The dining room served the same quality of food as the first-class kitchen, prepared by the same staff. The 709 passengers in third class, who occupied the lower and forward sections of the ship, had come from a wider geographic range than any other group aboard. The Irish contingent was substantial, many of them boarding at Queenstown on April 11th. There were families from Sweden, Finland, and Norway, from Poland and Russia and what is now Croatia and Bulgaria, from Lebanon and Syria, and from communities in England that had originally emigrated from elsewhere. Most of the third-class passengers had never been to New York. Most of them were headed to places they knew about, primarily through letters from family members who had gone before, describing wages and conditions and the particular quality of a new life in a country that had not yet decided to close its doors to the degree they would close a decade later. For many of the third-class passengers, this was the most expensive single decision they had ever made. The crossing cost approximately £8 in third class, and while that amount sounds modest, it represented months of saving for families who had been living on subsistence wages or farming marginal land. Some passengers had sold household furniture to raise the fare. Some had been helped by community collections. The emigrants who boarded at Queenstown, many of them from counties in the west of Ireland, were in most cases not planning to return, and the people who came to the dock to wave them off were in many cases doing so in the knowledge that they would not see them again. The ship's crew numbered approximately 900 people, drawn largely from Southampton and its surrounding area. The officers were experienced and held in high regard within the White Star Line. Captain Edward John Smith was the most senior captain the company employed, the Commodore of the fleet, who had been given command of each new White Star ship as it entered service and had planned to retire after this voyage. He had been at sea for most of his adult life. He was 62 years old. The wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, were employed not by the White Star Line, but by the Marconi Company, which held the contract for the ship's radio equipment. They were young. Phillips was 25. Bride was 22. They worked 12-hour shifts in the wireless room, processing a continuous stream of outgoing messages from passengers who wanted to communicate with people in New York or London, and incoming messages from other ships and shore stations. In the days before the collision, they had received and relayed messages confirming that the crossing was going well, that the ship was performing as expected, and that New York was 4 or 5 days ahead. Among the crew were also the musicians, the kitchen staff, the bedroom stewards who were responsible for each cabin on their corridor, the bath stewards who heated and prepared the Turkish baths, the gymnasium steward with his mechanical horse, and the postal workers who sorted mail in the sorting room below the waterline, handling the 3,364 bags of mail that the Titanic carried, in addition to her passengers. The ship was, technically, a Royal Mail ship, which was the RMS designation in her name, and the delivery of that mail to New York on schedule was, in the ordinary commercial logic of April 1912, as much a purpose of the voyage as anything else. All of these people were in Southampton by April 9th, 1912, and most of them were aboard by the morning of April 10. The city had hosted the departure of hundreds of ships. This one was different in ways that were hard to specify, beyond the obvious fact of size. Crowds had gathered along the dock for several days before departure. The lines were cast off at noon on April 10th, 1912. The largest ship in the world began to move for the first time since her sea trials. What happened next, in the first 10 minutes of the voyage, was not in anyone's plan. As the Titanic moved away from berth 44 in Southampton at noon on April 10th, 1912, the displacement of water by her passing hull created a suction effect so powerful that it broke the mooring ropes holding a smaller ship nearby. The ship in question was the SS New York, an American line vessel moored along the same dock. As the Titanic passed, the water drawn aside and then rushing back in her wake pulled the New York's stern away from the dock and swung it toward the Titanic's hull in a slow arc that, for several minutes, looked as though it would end in a collision before the voyage had properly begun. Captain Smith ordered the engines reversed. Tugs moved in quickly. The New York was brought back under control, and the gap between the two ships never closed to less than a few feet, though witnesses on the dock, who were close enough to see clearly, later described the near miss as more alarming than it appeared from a distance. The departure resumed. By early afternoon, the Titanic was clear of Southampton water and heading south through the Solent toward the English Channel. The first stop was Cherbourg, on the northern coast of France. The Titanic arrived there late in the afternoon of April 10 and spent approximately 90 minutes at anchor while tenders ferried additional passengers out to the ship. The harbour at Cherbourg was not large enough to accommodate a vessel of the Titanic's size at a dock, so passengers arrived by small boats and boarded through gangways on the ship's side. At Cherbourg, 274 additional passengers boarded, including most of the first-class ticket holders who had come to the ship from Paris and the broader European continent. The Titanic weighed anchor in the early evening and continued through the night toward the southwest, reaching Queenstown on the southern coast of Ireland at midday on April 11th. Queenstown, now called Cobh, served as the last European port of call and the point at which the majority of the third-class passengers boarding in Ireland came aboard. The same tender arrangement applied, with small boats carrying passengers and mail bags out to the anchored ship. Among the people who left the ship at Queenstown was a young stoker named John Coffey. Coffey was 23 years old, had signed on as crew in Southampton, and had apparently reconsidered the voyage during the overnight crossing from Cherbourg. He hid himself among the mail bags being transferred back to shore by the tender, was discovered, and was allowed to leave without being detained. He was, as it turned out, one of the last people to walk off the Titanic voluntarily. He survived. The tenders returned to shore. At approximately 1:30 in the afternoon on April 11th, the Titanic weighed anchor for the last time and turned her bow toward the open Atlantic. Ireland disappeared from the stern, and the only land ahead was the coast of North America, 4 to 5 days away, at the ship's service speed of roughly 21 to 22 knots. The total number of people aboard at this point was 2,224. The sea was calm. The weather was clear and cold. The season's ice conditions in the North Atlantic were worse than normal that year, with an unusually mild winter having broken more ice free from the Arctic than was typical. But this information was held by the meteorologists and the other ships in the region, and had not yet reached the officers on the Titanic's bridge in any form that changed their plans. Captain Smith set the course west-northwest. The engines held their speed. The passengers who came on deck that first afternoon and leaned against the railings would have seen the Irish coast shrinking behind them, the sea empty ahead, and a sky that was clear enough to suggest the crossing would be a smooth one. The first full day at sea was April 12. It was described by everyone who recorded their impressions as beautiful. The second full day, April 13, was the same. The sea was extraordinarily calm for the North Atlantic in April. The air was cold but clear, and the ship moved through it without the heavy rolling that was the usual accompaniment of an Atlantic crossing in early spring. Passengers who had worried about seasickness found they did not need to. Passengers who had booked the voyage partly for the ship's facilities found that the facilities were as described. The gymnasium was busy in the mornings. The pool was used in the afternoons. The promenade decks were occupied at all hours by people walking their daily constitutionals or sitting in deck chairs wrapped in blankets provided by the ship. In the evenings, the first-class reception room before dinner, filled with people who had dressed for the occasion in the way that people dressed for dinner at the better country houses of England, because the Titanic's designers had wanted the ship to feel like a country house, and on the first 3 evenings of the crossing, it did. In the background, almost unnoticed by the passengers, the 2 wireless operators in the Marconi room were processing everything that the ship's position generated. personal messages from passengers, navigational communications between ships, and the first reports of ice in the shipping lanes to the north and west, which were arriving from other vessels in the area with increasing frequency as the days passed. The Titanic continued west. The music played every evening in the reception room. The crossing was, by every ordinary measure, going well. Life aboard the Titanic during the 4 days of the crossing settled into a rhythm that the ship had been designed to produce. The first-class promenade deck was busy in the mornings. Passengers walked in circuits of the enclosed promenade, which was glassed in on its outer side to protect against wind, counting laps and tracking their daily distance in the way that people on long sea voyages have always used the ship's own geography to maintain a sense of physical regularity. Deck chairs could be rented from the ship's stewards, and those passengers who preferred to sit rather than walk wrapped themselves in the blankets provided and watched the sea. The sea offered very little to watch in the usual sense. The North Atlantic, in April, at 21 knots, was a continuous expanse of grey-green water in all directions, occasionally interrupted by whitecaps when the wind came up, and absolutely featureless when it did not. What passengers reported finding in this view, repeatedly in letters written during the crossing and in survivor accounts given afterward, was not boredom, but something like the particular quality of rest that comes from looking at something genuinely empty. The ocean did not require anything from the people looking at it. It was simply there, enormous and indifferent. And many passengers found that in looking at it for the first time, they felt something they had difficulty naming, a suspension of the ordinary weight of affairs, a sense of being briefly outside the normal flow of obligation and consequence. The Titanic's library was well used. The reading and writing room was quiet at most hours. Passengers wrote letters that would be posted from New York, composed diary entries, finished books they had been meaning to read. In the evenings, the first-class reception room was the gathering point before dinner, and the quality of the company assembled there was, by any standard, extraordinary. The crossing had attracted not only the wealthy but the interesting, people who were in various ways at the center of the cultural and commercial life of the Edwardian Atlantic world, and who were, for 5 days, confined to a space where the only available company was each other. By Sunday, April 14, the ship had been at sea for 4 days. It was the 5th day of the voyage, counting the departure day. The sea was still calm. The temperature had been falling since the previous day, noticeably so, and this cold was a different cold from the chill of the open deck. It had a quality that experienced Atlantic sailors recognized as the cold that accompanies ice, the particular dead-air cold of water that has been in contact with something frozen. Several passengers mentioned it in their accounts. One wrote in a letter that night that the air outside smelled different from the days before. The ship received 5 ice warnings on April 14th from other vessels in the area. The first came from the Caronia in the morning, reporting field ice and bergs at a position approximately 150 miles ahead. Others followed through the day from the Baltic, the America, the Mesaba, and finally the Californian late in the evening. The Californian's warning, sent at around 10:30 at night, was the most urgent, reporting that the ship had stopped for the night surrounded by pack ice at a position directly in the Titanic's path. The wireless operator on the Titanic, Jack Phillips, was at that moment overwhelmed with a backlog of personal messages from passengers that needed to be relayed to a shore station at Cape Race, Newfoundland. He cut the Californian's operator off mid-transmission and told him to stay out of the airwaves. Captain Smith had received several of the earlier warnings. He had plotted the reported ice positions on his chart. He had not reduced speed. The rationale, common among North Atlantic captains of the era, was that clear weather and good visibility made it possible to navigate safely through or around ice fields at service speed, and that stopping or slowing would delay arrival in New York, inconveniencing passengers and disrupting the schedule. The White Star Line chairman J. Bruce Ismay was aboard and had discussed arriving a day early. The ship continued at approximately 22 knots. The lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, were in the crow's nest without binoculars. The binoculars that should have been in the crow's nest locker had gone missing before departure from Southampton, possibly transferred during a last-minute change of lookout personnel, and no replacement pair had been sourced in the days since. The lookouts had reported this at the start of their watch. They had been told to keep a sharp eye and watch carefully. The night was extraordinarily beautiful. The sky was completely clear, no moon, and the stars were brilliant and still, in a way that multiple witnesses described independently, using the same word, brilliant. The sea was flat and glassy, no swell, no chop, no disturbance of any kind. The ship moved through it without vibration, smoothly enough that passengers in their cabins, who had not yet gone to sleep, could not tell they were at sea at all. At 11:40 in the evening of April 14, 1912, Frederick Fleet saw something directly ahead. He rang the crow's nest bell 3 times. Before the bell rang in the crow's nest, the music had been playing. The Titanic was unusual among ocean liners in carrying 2 separate musical ensembles, rather than the single ensemble that was standard on ships of the era. The first was a 5-piece band led by Wallace Hartley, a 33-year-old violinist from Colne in Lancashire, who had previously played aboard the Mauretania and the Lusitania before joining the White Star Fleet. Hartley's band played primarily in the first-class reception room and the dining saloon, providing the background music for the pre-dinner gatherings and for the afternoon teas that were a fixture of first-class ocean crossings. The second ensemble was a trio that performed separately in the Café Parisien, providing accompaniment for the more informal second-class restaurant and lounge areas. The musicians were not employees of the White Star Line. They were contracted through an agency called CW and FN Black, based in Liverpool, which held an exclusive contract with several shipping lines to supply shipboard musicians. Under the terms of their employment, the musicians were responsible for their own uniforms, their own instruments, and a portion of their own travel expenses. They were listed on the ship's manifest as second-class passengers rather than crew, which placed them in an ambiguous category that would later prove significant in the legal proceedings following the disaster. They were not given crew pay. They received a small retainer from the agency and supplemented it with gratuities from passengers, which on a ship like the Titanic, crossing with a high proportion of wealthy and generous first-class passengers, could be substantial. The repertoire that Hartley's band played was the standard repertoire of the Edwardian shipboard musician, a mixture of light classical pieces, popular songs of the day, music hall standards, ragtime numbers, and the waltzes and quadrilles that filled the dance cards at formal evening events in London and New York. The music was not ambitious in the concert hall sense. It was designed to sit beneath conversation without demanding attention, to provide an atmosphere rather than a performance, to be present without insisting on being heard. On the evenings of April 11th, 12 and 13, the musicians played their usual sets in their usual locations. Passengers in the first-class reception room dressed for dinner and gathered before the first sitting. The band played, and the conversation filled the room in the way it fills any room where well-traveled people with something in common are meeting for the first time. On Sunday, April 14th, there was a more formal evening concert, as was customary on Sunday crossings, and several passengers later described it as one of the more pleasant evenings of the crossing. The music good, the company agreeable, the sea invisible through the windows, but felt in the particular stillness of the ship's movement. At approximately 10 o'clock on the night of April 14, the evening had wound down enough that the band had finished their final set, and many passengers had retired to their cabins. The ship was quiet in the way that ships become quiet late on the 4th night of a crossing, when the novelty has worn off and the body clock has adjusted to the ship's time and the routine has settled. Some passengers were reading, some were already asleep. The wireless room was busy with messages. What happened to the 8 musicians after the ship struck the iceberg has been reported in many conflicting accounts, and the full truth is uncertain. What is broadly agreed upon is that at some point, while lifeboats were being loaded, the musicians gathered on the deck and played. They played for approximately 2 hours, in the cold, while the ship listing and the lifeboats being lowered made clear to everyone on deck that what was happening was serious. The music they played in those 2 hours is disputed. Different survivors reported hearing different pieces. The hymn most commonly associated with the scene is Nearer My God to Thee, though maritime historians have noted that the evidence for this is anecdotal and inconsistent, and that some survivors reported they were playing ragtime and popular music rather than hymns when they last heard them. None of the 8 musicians survived. Wallace Hartley's body was recovered from the sea. When it was brought aboard the recovery vessel, it was found that his violin had been strapped to his body with a leather strap. He had lashed it to himself before the end, whether to carry it with him or to prevent it from being lost. The violin was identified in 2013 by a silver plate engraved with his name and a dedication from his fiancée, Maria Robinson, who had given it to him as a gift. The identification was verified by forensic examination. In October 2013, the violin was sold at auction in Devizes, England, for £1,100,000. The buyer has not been publicly identified. The violin is somewhere. The bell rang in the crow's nest at 11:40 in the evening, and the music stopped, and what had been a crossing like any other crossing stopped being that. First Officer William Murdoch was at the bridge when the telephone rang from the crow's nest. Frederick Fleet's report was brief. Iceberg, right ahead. Murdoch's response was immediate. He ordered the helm hard to starboard, which in the helm conventions of 1912 would swing the bow to the left, and ordered the engine rooms to stop and then reverse the engines. He also activated the switch that closed the ship's watertight doors throughout the lower decks. The Titanic was approximately 500 yards from the iceberg when Fleet spotted it. At 22 knots, that distance was covered in under 40 seconds. The bow had begun to swing left, but not far enough. The starboard side of the hull struck the iceberg below the waterline, and the berg scraped along the ship's side for roughly 300 feet before the two separated. Passengers inside the ship described the impact in terms that suggested something far less serious than it was. A shudder, a grinding sensation beneath the feet, a sound one survivor compared to tearing cloth. Several passengers on the lower decks reported fragments of ice falling into their open portholes. At least one account describes a passenger picking a piece of ice off his cabin floor, finding it cold and unremarkable, and going back to sleep. Officers and stewards who were asked immediately afterward told passengers not to worry. The word used in several accounts was routine. Thomas Andrews went below. He moved quickly through the forward sections of the ship with Captain Smith, carrying the notebook he had brought aboard to record observations during the crossing. The mail room was already flooding, seawater rising fast enough that the postal workers inside had scrambled out and left the mail behind. The squash court, one deck above, was ankle deep. Water was rising in 5 of the 16 watertight compartments, the first 5 from the bow. The ship had been designed to float with any 4 adjacent watertight compartments flooded. 5 were compromised. Andrews did the calculation in the same way any naval architect familiar with the hull design would have done, and he gave Captain Smith his assessment. The ship had between 1 hour and 1 hour and a half. There were 2,224 people aboard. The lifeboats had capacity for approximately 1,178. The water temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees below the freezing point of fresh water. At that temperature, an unprotected person in the sea would lose consciousness within roughly 15 minutes and die within 30. The ship carried no immersion suits. On the boat deck, passengers who had come up from their cabins in response to the stopped engines found a night of extraordinary beauty. The air was deeply cold, sharp enough to make breathing uncomfortable, but the sky was clear in every direction, the stars brilliant and absolutely still. The sea was flat and black, and made no sound. The ship sat motionless in the water. Without the vibration of the engines, the deck was more stable than it had been since Southampton. Several passengers recorded the experience of standing on the boat deck in the first hour after the collision as among the most peaceful moments of the voyage. The ship felt solid beneath them. The night was clear. The few icebergs visible on the dark horizon were white and silent, more like features of the landscape than objects of any concern. One first-class passenger wrote in a letter during the hour after the collision that the night was so beautiful she almost wished they could simply remain stopped where they were. By approximately 12:25 in the morning, officers had begun loading lifeboats on both sides of the ship. The operation was not proceeding well. First-class passengers on the upper decks were reluctant to climb into small wooden boats suspended 75 feet above the flat, dark sea. The ship felt safe. The lifeboats did not. Several of the first boats to leave were less than half full. Boat number 7, one of the first launched, left with only 28 of its 65 available seats occupied. The officers loading it had asked for more passengers and been refused. In the wireless room, Jack Phillips had been transmitting the distress signal without pause since approximately 12:15 in the morning, sending the call in both the old Morse code distress signal and the newly adopted SOS. The Carpathia, a Cunard ship 58 miles southeast of the Titanic's position, had picked up the signal at 12:25 a.m. Her captain, Arthur Rostron, had immediately ordered a turn north and maximum speed 4 hours away at 14 knots. The bow was beginning to sit lower than the stern. Not dramatically, not visibly to most of the passengers on deck, but the tilt was there and it was increasing. Andrews knew what it meant. Smith knew what it meant. The officers loading the lifeboats knew what it meant. The stars were still brilliant. The sea was still flat. The water in the mailroom had reached the ceiling. The loading of the lifeboats continued for approximately 2 hours after the collision, and the picture it produced was one of the more painful episodes in the disaster. Boats that could carry 60 or 65 people being lowered into a flat, calm sea carrying 20 or 30, while the ship behind them still had over 1,000 people aboard. The reluctance was understandable in the context of what people could see. From the boat deck, the Titanic still looked and felt like the safest place available. The sea was far below and dark and cold. The lifeboats were small and unfamiliar and required a 70-foot descent on ropes before touching the water. The ship had not yet tilted visibly enough that most passengers felt any urgency. Officers who urged passengers to board were told that people preferred to wait, to see what developed, to stay on the ship rather than commit to the uncertainty of the small wooden boats. What developed, over the 2 hours between 12:25 and approximately 2:18 in the morning, was the visible and then unmistakable tipping of the bow downward. In the last 30 to 40 minutes, the tilt became steep enough that passengers on the afterdecks were holding rails and furniture to keep their footing, and the noise from the ship as her internal fittings shifted, broke free, and fell forward was continuous and extraordinary. The Titanic sank at 2:20 in the morning of April 15, 1912, 2 hours and 40 minutes after the iceberg. The ship did not sink intact. She broke apart at the surface, the forward section pulling away from the stern as the bow went under, and the weight of the flooded forward compartment separated the two halves at the join between them. The bow section went down first, relatively intact, traveling 2.5 miles to the ocean floor. The stern section, released from the downward pull of the bow, rose briefly, then flooded and sank, breaking further apart as it went. Approximately 1,500 people died. The figure is not exact, because the final passenger and crew manifest was itself uncertain, and some of those who entered the water may never have been found. What is established is that of the 2,224 people aboard, approximately 705 survived. The sea temperature of 28 degrees Fahrenheit meant that anyone in the water without protective equipment had minutes, not hours. The first lifeboats did not return to pick up survivors from the water, despite the fact that they had room and the distance was navigable. The reasons given in subsequent testimony varied: fear that the boats would be swamped, uncertainty about how close to approach, the sounds coming from the water. The last survivor accounts described the sounds from the water as lasting approximately 20 minutes before they faded. 16 of the 20 lifeboats survived the sinking. One collapsible lifeboat was swept off the deck and floated free. Another capsized during the launch but remained floating, and survivors clung to its bottom throughout the night. In the early hours of April 15th, scattered across a section of the North Atlantic Ocean, 705 people in wooden boats waited in the cold for the ship that had answered the distress call. The Carpathia arrived at 4:10 in the morning. Captain Arthur Rostron had pushed his ship through ice-filled water at 14 knots across a course that required him to sail toward the same ice field that had sunk the Titanic, posting extra lookouts and ordering his engine rooms to give him every possible knot. He arrived to find the lifeboats spread across a wide area in the dark, and the first light of dawn revealing the full scene: the ice all around, the flat sea, the boats, and no sign of the ship that had sent the distress call 6 hours earlier. The 705 survivors were brought aboard the Carpathia across the morning hours. The last lifeboat was alongside the Carpathia by approximately 8:30 in the morning. Many of the survivors were in states of shock, significant enough that ship's physicians noted it in their reports. Some were hypothermic, some were silent for hours, some would not discuss what they had witnessed for years or ever. The Carpathia turned toward New York. The weather, which had been unremarkable throughout the crossing until the night before, now produced a heavy fog, then rain, then more fog. The ship arrived at New York on the evening of April 18, 1912, 3 days after the sinking. A crowd estimated at 30,000 people had gathered at the docks. Thomas Andrews was not among the survivors. Captain Smith was not among the survivors. Jack Phillips, who had been transmitting the distress signal without pause until the final minutes, was not among the survivors. Harold Bride, the junior wireless operator, was. He was rescued from the overturned collapsible lifeboat with severe frostbite on both feet. The world had been following the story for 3 days by the time the Carpathia docked, and what it was waiting to decide was what the sinking meant, and who was responsible, and what should change. The news reached the world in stages, and each stage was worse than the one before. The first reports, published on the morning of April 15th, based on fragmentary wireless messages picked up by shore stations, said the Titanic had struck an iceberg and was being assisted by other ships, with all passengers reported safe. Newspapers in New York and London ran those early reports as reassurance. By afternoon on April 15th, the picture had changed. By the following morning, April 16th, it was clear. The ship had sunk, and most of the people aboard had not survived. The scale of the event made it among the most heavily reported news stories of the era. Within a week, newspapers in Britain, the United States, Canada, and across Europe had published extensive coverage. The story had elements that made it legible from any point on the social spectrum. The ship had carried the very wealthy and the very poor. It had been described in the press before the voyage as exceptionally safe, and the death toll was large enough to be genuinely staggering. It was also the kind of story with a physical cause, an iceberg, a speed, a set of decisions that invited investigation and accountability in a way that purely natural disasters did not. The United States Senate inquiry began on April 19, 1912, 4 days after the Carpathia docked, while many of the survivors were still in New York. It was called by Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan, who subpoenaed the surviving officers and passengers before they could sail back to Britain. The inquiry ran for 18 days, took testimony from 82 witnesses, and produced a report that was sharply critical of the ship's speed in iceberg conditions, the insufficient number of lifeboats, and the response of nearby ships, particularly the Californian, whose officers had seen rockets from the Titanic during the sinking and had not responded. The British Board of Trade Inquiry, which began in May 1912 under Commissioner Lord Mersey, ran longer and took testimony from 97 witnesses across 36 days of hearings. It reached broadly similar conclusions. The ship had been traveling too fast given the known ice conditions, the lifeboat provision was inadequate, and the Board of Trade's own regulations on lifeboat capacity were in need of revision, which was an awkward conclusion for an inquiry conducted by the Board of Trade to reach about itself. J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, had been aboard and had survived by boarding a lifeboat during the final stages of the evacuation. The press and the inquiries treated his survival as a question requiring explanation. His defense, that there were no more passengers waiting to board the lifeboat he entered, was accepted by both inquiries, but rejected by public opinion in a way that effectively ended his public career. He retired from the White Star Line in 1913 and lived largely in seclusion until his death in 1937. The practical changes that came from the disaster were significant and lasted. The first International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, known as SOLAS, was drawn up in 1914 and established for the first time a set of international requirements for passenger ship safety. It required that all ships carry enough lifeboat capacity for every person aboard. It required mandatory lifeboat drills. It required 24-hour wireless watch on all passenger ships so that no distress signal would ever again go unanswered because an operator had gone to sleep. The International Ice Patrol was established in 1914, funded jointly by the nations that sent ships across the North Atlantic, with the specific mission of monitoring iceberg conditions in the shipping lanes and broadcasting warnings. The Ice Patrol is still operating today, more than a century later, providing the same service it was created to provide. In all the years since its establishment, no ship following the monitored shipping lanes and acting on its warnings has been lost to an iceberg. Captain Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia received the Congressional Gold Medal from the United States Congress in recognition of his response to the distress call. He had turned his ship through ice-filled water at maximum speed in the dark toward a position he could only estimate, and had arrived in time to rescue everyone who had survived the night. He was knighted in 1926 and died in 1940. The wreck of the Titanic, 882 feet of steel in two pieces at the bottom of the North Atlantic, received none of these recognitions. It was simply gone, at a depth and in conditions that made any access to it practically impossible, with the technology of 1912 or 1922 or 1932, or for a considerable time afterward. For 73 years, the ship lay where she had landed, in darkness and cold and silence, entirely beyond the reach of the world that had built her. The Titanic had been on the ocean floor for less than a year before the first salvage proposal appeared in print. In 1913, a Denver architect named Charles Smith proposed raising the ship using electromagnets suspended from pontoons. The plan assumed the wreck was relatively intact and sitting in accessible water. It was neither. The depth was not yet precisely known, but estimates from the time of the sinking placed it at roughly 2 miles, far beyond the reach of any diving technology then available or foreseeable. The plan was not seriously pursued. Over the following decades, the proposals multiplied. A 1930s scheme involved filling the ship with thousands of tons of Vaseline, which would solidify in the cold water and make the hull buoyant. A 1960s proposal by Douglas Woolley, a retired factory worker from Nottingham, involved pumping the wreck full of liquid nitrogen or polyurethane foam to create enough buoyancy to lift her. A plan discussed in the 1970s proposed attaching balloons filled with a buoyant medium to the hull and floating it to the surface. Each proposal was met with the same fundamental objection. The ship was at a depth of approximately 12,500 feet. The pressure at that depth exceeded 6,000 pounds per square inch. The North Atlantic was a hostile environment by any measure, and no technology existed that could operate effectively in those conditions. The problem was not only depth, the wreck's precise location was unknown. The ship had sunk in the middle of the North Atlantic, in an area without landmarks, at coordinates that had been approximated during the confusion of the sinking and had not been independently verified since. The last position Captain Smith had been given before the collision placed the ship at approximately 41 degrees 46 minutes north latitude, 50 degrees 14 minutes west longitude. Later analysis suggested this position was off by approximately 13 miles, which at 12,500 feet of depth meant searching an enormous area of featureless ocean floor with instruments that did not yet exist. The tools that would eventually make the discovery possible had their origins in military technology, specifically in the programs developed by the United States Navy during the Cold War to monitor and recover lost submarines. The USS Thresher had sunk in April 1963, killing all 129 crew members in approximately 8,400 feet of water off Cape Cod. The USS Scorpion had sunk in May 1968, killing all 99 crew members in approximately 9,800 feet of water in the mid-Atlantic. Both submarines carried nuclear reactors. The Navy had a powerful and classified interest in locating the wrecks, assessing the condition of the reactors, and determining whether there was any ongoing risk to the surrounding environment. To locate the submarines, the Navy developed and refined a set of deep water imaging technologies, including the Argo system, a camera sled towed at depth that could transmit video imagery in real time to the surface ship above. The system was capable of operating at depths that exceeded the Titanic's, and the technique that proved most effective for finding the submarines was not searching for the hull itself, but searching for the debris field, the trail of lighter objects that had spread across the ocean floor from the point of implosion and extended for miles in the direction the submarine had been moving when it sank. Robert Ballard was a marine geologist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Massachusetts, who had been interested in the Titanic since his student years and had been developing deep water imaging technology for applications in oceanographic research. In 1982, he approached the US Navy with a proposal. He would use the remaining operational time from classified submarine survey missions to search for the Titanic, and in exchange for the Navy's support and funding, he would conduct assessments of the Thresher and Scorpion wrecks that the Navy needed. The Navy agreed. The arrangement was kept confidential. Ballard spent the summer and autumn of 1984 locating and surveying the two submarines, producing the reports the Navy required. When that work was done, he had 12 days of ship time remaining. He partnered with Jean-Louis Michel of the French research institution Ifremer, whose team had already spent one season searching the area with a different imaging system and had covered a significant portion of the probable search zone without finding the wreck. The French phase had established where the Titanic probably was not. What it had not found was the debris trail that Ballard now believed extended far beyond the hull itself, a long streak of objects scattered across the ocean floor that would be easier to locate than the hull alone. In late August 1985, Ballard boarded the research vessel Nor at the Azores with his team and the Argo system, pointed the ship toward the North Atlantic, and began to look. He had 12 days. The search area covered approximately 150 square miles of ocean floor. The Argo system was towed behind the Nor on a cable several miles long, maintaining a position close to the ocean floor, while the ship above moved at a slow, steady speed through the search grid. The cameras transmitted video continuously to monitors in the control room, where a rotating crew of scientists and technicians watched the screens around the clock, looking for anything on the ocean floor that was not rock or sediment. For the first 8 days, the monitors showed rock and sediment. The search grid was organized around Ballard's working theory, developed from his experience with the submarine wrecks, that the Titanic's debris trail would be the key. The ship had broken apart on the surface, and the lighter materials from the interior, the furniture, the luggage, the fixtures, the coal, all of the objects that had been inside the hull when it sank, would have spread across the floor in a field that extended in the direction of the ship's final movement before sinking. Finding this field would lead to the hull. The field was larger and more diffuse than the hull, and therefore easier to detect with an imaging system sweeping the floor. The ship carried approximately 900 tons of coal in her bunkers at the time of the sinking. Coal is identifiable. It does not dissolve or biodegrade on the ocean floor within a human lifetime, and it is distinctive enough from the surrounding sediment to register clearly on the camera system. Ballard's team was watching for coal and for any manufactured object that would indicate they had entered the debris field. The 9 days that preceded the discovery had a quality that members of Ballard's crew later described as a particular kind of tension, sustained and unglamorous. The tension of watching a monitor for hour after hour in the hope that something different would appear. The North Atlantic in late summer is not a comfortable place for a research vessel. The weather had been difficult for several days, and the search grid required constant correction as the ship was pushed by surface conditions. The mood in the control room, according to crew accounts, was one of persistent low-level anxiety about the remaining time and the area still uncovered. By the early hours of September 1, the Nor had been at sea for more than 8 days and had covered a substantial portion of the search grid. The remaining unsearched area corresponded roughly to the zone where the French team had been working during the previous season before their equipment had failed, which meant that if the Titanic was in the area Ballard's calculations predicted, it was likely in the section the French had not quite reached. At 12 minutes before 1 o'clock in the morning on September 1st, 1985, the camera system began showing pieces of metal on the ocean floor. Then more pieces, close together. Then a cylindrical object, heavily corroded, recognizable by any member of the team who had looked at the 1911 construction photographs. A Titanic boiler. Robert Ballard had been in his bunk when the discovery was made. The cook woke him. He came to the control room and found his crew gathered around the monitors, watching the boiler pass across the screen. The mood in the room was not celebration, but something closer to the feeling of a room where people have been given unexpected and very large news and have not yet decided what to do with it. Ballard's first act was to take his team up to the open deck. It was 12:56 in the morning. The sea was dark and moderate. He called for a moment of silence, and the crew stood together in the wind on the deck of the Nor, in the middle of the North Atlantic, 2.5 miles above the ship they had been looking for, and were quiet. In the days that followed, the Argo system photographed the wreck extensively. The bow section was located upright, its prow buried in the sediment of the ocean floor. The stern section was found several hundred yards away, significantly more damaged. The debris field between them stretched for more than a mile. Ballard's team photographed what they could and took no artifacts. Ballard had made a decision before the voyage that if they found the ship, he would treat the site as a memorial and not as a source of material, and he held to that. The discovery was announced on September 9th, 1985, when the Nor returned to Woods Hole, Massachusetts. The dock was crowded with journalists and cameras and people who had come simply to be present when the news became official. Ballard gave his statement and then described the site in the words that would later become the most often repeated description of the wreck. He said it was a quiet and peaceful place, and a fitting place for the remains of this greatest of sea tragedies to rest. He said he hoped it would remain that way. He meant it as an instruction as much as an observation. In 1986, the year after the discovery, Ballard returned to the Titanic with the submersible Alvin and a remotely operated vehicle called Jason Jr., small enough to pass through the ship's doorways and film the interior spaces. The descent to the wreck took 2.5 hours each way, and the time available on the bottom per dive was limited by the submersible's battery capacity and the crew's endurance. What those dives produced was the first detailed visual documentation of what the wreck looked like 73 years after the sinking. The bow section, when approached from the surface by the submersible, appeared from a distance as a dark shape on a flat plain. The prow was buried in the sediment up to the anchor chains, which meant the bow had arrived at the ocean floor at significant speed and driven itself partly into the mud. The forward deck was recognizable, the bollards and capstans and the mooring equipment still in place, covered in the rust-orange bacterial formations that would later be identified as a distinct biological community. The bridge windows were gone, their frames empty, the roof partially collapsed, but the overall structure of the forward ship was intact enough to be recognizable from the deck plans. The mast still stood, bent at its base. Jason Jr. was sent inside. The footage it returned showed corridors still largely intact in the forward sections of the ship, doors standing open on some staterooms, wallpaper still visible on the walls in a few locations where it had been protected enough to survive partial oxidation, and the ironwork of fixtures remaining in rooms that had otherwise lost all their wooden and fabric contents. The ceramic tiles of the Turkish baths were still in place in some sections of F-deck. The ornate ironwork of the Café Parisien's trellis could be made out on the walls. The crow's nest was there, the platform from which Frederick Fleet had spotted the iceberg at 11:40 on the night of April 14th, bent and damaged, still attached to the mast above the ship's bow. The stern section, found approximately 2,000 feet from the bow, was a different picture. Where the bow section retained a form that recalled the ship, the stern had largely lost that quality. It had imploded as it sank, the air inside compressed by increasing pressure until the structure collapsed, and it had also broken apart further during the impact with the ocean floor. What the submersible found was a mass of twisted steel, recognizable as the stern of a large ship only because the context established it as such. Deck sections lay at angles, collapsed into each other. The massive propellers and the propeller shafts, too dense to have been significantly damaged by the implosion, protruded from the mud nearby. Between the two main sections of the hull, the debris field extended for more than a mile across the ocean floor. It contained an estimated hundreds of thousands of objects, and the character of what it held told the story of what had been inside the ship when it sank. Luggage, mostly opened or burst by the pressure, the contents spread across the sediment. Dishes and cups and serving pieces bearing the White Star Line's crest in the off-white enamel of the third-class ware and the finer china of the first. Cooking pots and brass fittings and wooden furniture components, the wood largely gone and the brass remaining. Wine bottles, intact, standing upright in the sediment. Thousands of pieces of coal scattered across the whole area. And shoes. Hundreds of pairs of shoes, lying on the sediment in pairs, as they would have lain if removed from feet and set down beside a bed. Leather outlasts the human body in cold, dark, anoxic deep-sea water. What remains of the people who were aboard the Titanic is not bones, which have been consumed by the ocean, but the material they surrounded themselves with. The shoes in pairs represent the most direct evidence of presence. They are where the people were. Several expeditions, in the years following Ballard's initial 1986 dives, recovered artifacts from the debris field. The salvage company RMS Titanic Inc., which has held exclusive salvage rights to the wreck since 1994, has recovered more than 5,500 objects, including the ship's bronze telegraphs, the compass from the bridge, luggage, jewelry, and the ship's bell from the crow's nest. Ballard remained opposed to this activity, publicly and consistently, and continued to argue that the site should be treated as a maritime grave, inviolate. The view from inside the submersible, hovering in the darkness above the debris field, was described by members of multiple diving teams as unlike any other experience available to a human being. The absolute dark, the cold, the silence, the presence of objects that had last been in human hands on a warm April evening in 1912. Nothing moved except the occasional deep-sea fish or crab crossing the field of the lights. The objects lay exactly where they had landed. They will lie there until the ocean finishes what it started on the night of April 14th, which is a process already well underway. The orange formations that cover most of the Titanic's visible hull surfaces are not rust in the simple sense of iron oxidizing in the presence of oxygen. They are rusticles, living structures produced by communities of microorganisms that consume the iron from the ship's steel and excrete it in forms that build up into the icicle-like shapes that now hang from every exposed surface. Rusticles are not a single organism, but a community. They contain bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms, organized into a cooperative structure that functions like a slow-moving organism in its own right, growing toward iron-rich surfaces, extracting metal, and depositing the processed material in the characteristic orange-brown formations, visible in every photograph taken at the wreck since the 1980s. They change continuously. Expeditions returning to the wreck at intervals of several years have found that the rustical formations that were present on a previous dive have changed position, changed shape, or disappeared entirely, replaced by new formations elsewhere. They are not static decorations. They are the mechanism by which the ocean is dismantling the ship. In 2010, researchers at Dalhousie University in Canada, working with samples of rustical material collected from the Titanic, identified a previously unknown species of iron-eating bacteria in the community. The new species was named Halomonas titanicae, in honor of the ship from whose hull it had been recovered. It is a formal scientific name, given in the standard binomial nomenclature of biological taxonomy, and it will persist in the scientific literature for as long as scientific records are kept. One way in which the Titanic's name will continue to exist even after the last visible trace of the ship itself has been consumed. The iron that the rustical communities extract from the hull does not disappear. It is processed into dissolved iron ions that enter the surrounding water and eventually enter the broader ocean chemistry, available to phytoplankton and other organisms that require iron for their growth. The Titanic, in this sense, is not simply decaying. She is being converted back into a component of the ocean she sank in. A steel ship is becoming, very slowly, a contribution to the chemistry of the deep Atlantic. The broader ecosystem that has colonized the wreck includes more than the rustical communities. The ship's structure provides a hard substrate in a region of ocean floor that would otherwise offer only soft sediment, and hard substrate is valuable real estate in the deep sea. Sea anemones have established themselves on the hull and on the larger objects in the debris field. Sea cucumbers move across the sediment in the surrounding area. Deep sea crabs cross the debris field. Rat-tail fish, common residents of the deep Atlantic floor, have been filmed over the wreck in most expeditions. The Titanic has, in the century since it arrived at the bottom of the North Atlantic, become part of the ecosystem of that floor, a feature of the landscape that other organisms have organized themselves around. The rate at which the hull is deteriorating has accelerated in recent decades. Multiple expeditions have documented areas of structural collapse that were not present on previous dives. Sections of deck that have caved in, areas of the hull where the steel is thin enough that the rustical communities have eaten through it and left gaps. The most recent expedition to the site, conducted in 2022 by a private company using deep-sea submersibles, produced footage comparing the wreck's condition with footage from the previous dive in 2019 and found significant additional deterioration in the 3-year interval. Estimates of how long the wreck will remain visually recognizable vary. Some researchers have placed the timeline at 2030 for significant additional structural collapse. Others argue the bow section, the most intact portion, may remain largely recognizable for somewhat longer. The stern section, already severely damaged, is expected to lose its remaining form earlier. At some point, in a time frame that is measured in decades rather than centuries, What is currently a visible, photographable shipwreck will become a field of iron-processed sediment. Orange-brown, flat, unmarked, the debris field still present, but the ship herself gone. The bacteria will still be there. Halomonas titanicae, named after her, still working through whatever iron remains. What the ocean is doing to the Titanic is not destruction in the sense of violence or loss. It is the same process the ocean applies to everything that arrives at its floor. A slow, patient, systematic conversion of what was made back into what the sea requires. The ship was built from iron extracted from the earth. The earth is reclaiming it through the mediation of the sea. It will take some more decades. It is already well advanced. In the meantime, the objects scattered across the debris field remain. They are not iron, most of them, and they are not going anywhere nearly as quickly. More than 5,500 objects have been recovered from the Titanic's debris field by the salvage expeditions that have worked the site since the late 1980s. The company that holds the exclusive salvage rights, RMS Titanic Inc., has mounted multiple expeditions and brought up items ranging from the ship's bronze deck telegraphs to individual pieces of passenger jewelry to a section of the hull itself, a large curved piece of steel plate recovered in 1998 and subsequently displayed in exhibitions around the world. The objects that survive well in the cold, dark, anoxic conditions of the deep Atlantic are not always the ones that intuition would predict. Metal corrodes. The iron hull is being consumed by bacteria, but certain materials survive with startling fidelity. Porcelain and ceramic objects are essentially unchanged by a century at 12,500 feet. The White Star Line's crockery, recovered from the debris field with the company's design still visible in the glaze, looks as it would have looked being cleared from a dining table in April 1912. Glass objects, sealed against the water, survive intact. Leather survives for a considerable time in conditions without oxygen, which is why the shoes are still present, and why some leather bags and cases have been recovered with their form intact. Paper survives under certain conditions, specifically when it has been protected from contact with the water by surrounding objects or sediment. Letters and documents recovered from the wreck include personal correspondence, official ship documents, and items of practical interest about the crossing. A menu from the first meal served aboard the Titanic on April 10, 1912, survived in legible condition and was sold at auction for £51,000. The practicality of the information it contains, meals that people ate on an April afternoon a century ago, serves as a strange and specific form of time travel. The passengers who came aboard at Southampton had packed their bags with the intention of unpacking them in New York 5 days later, and the objects in the debris field reflect this intention without irony. They include pocket watches stopped at times that may or may not reflect the moment they were submerged. They include currency, coins which survive indefinitely in salt water, and paper notes which do not. But paper currency was recovered in some cases where it had been protected. They include children's toys, personal jewelry, spectacles, combs, sewing kits, and all the small portable equipment of ordinary life in 1912. They include a leather Bible, its text still legible in the recovered portions. They include the first-class tableware with the White Star Line's crest, and the simpler enamelware of the third-class dining room, both ending in the same place. The controversy over whether these objects should have been removed has been present since the first recovery expeditions and has not been fully resolved. Ballard's position, maintained consistently, is that the site is a maritime grave and should be treated as one, the objects left where they are as the property of the dead rather than a resource for salvage. The opposing position, held by the salvage company and others, argues that the objects will be destroyed by the wreck's ongoing deterioration within decades, and that recovery preserves what would otherwise be lost, allowing the objects to be seen in exhibitions and to serve as physical connections to the people who owned them. Both positions contain a genuine argument. The objects in the exhibitions do serve as connections to the people. A pair of shoes recovered from the debris field, displayed in a museum case, carries information that a photograph does not. This is an object that a person touched, that a person's foot was inside, that a person packed and carried and intended to wear in a city they never reached. The physical presence of the thing provides a form of encounter with the past that representation does not. At the same time, the site is the location of approximately 1,500 people who died and whose remains have been entirely consumed by the ocean. What is left of them in the physical sense is exactly the shoes in pairs, and the luggage, and the belongings, and the objects that were in their pockets, or on their wrists, or in their bags. The things that were with them are the last physical evidence of their presence. They are, in the most literal sense, all that remains. The objects recovered from the Titanic are held in storage and on display in various locations. The exhibitions that have toured internationally have been seen by millions of people. The question of who owns the objects, what the legal status of the wreck is, and what should eventually happen to the recovered material has been the subject of legal proceedings in the United States and of international discussions that have not produced a final resolution. In the meantime, at 12,500 feet, the debris field continues to hold what it holds. Most of the objects are still there. The shoes are still there. The coins are still there. The rust-colored icicles are still growing on the steel above them, and the ocean is still working, patiently, on the hull. The ocean floor at 12,500 feet is not nothing. It is a specific place, with a specific character, and people who have been there in submersibles describe it in terms that share enough vocabulary to suggest they are describing something real, rather than simply a projection of their own prior expectations. The first quality is darkness. At this depth, no sunlight reaches the floor. The only light is what the submersibles bring with them, and that light falls on a small circle of ocean floor and then stops. The surrounding darkness, total and complete in every direction. People who have been in submersibles at this depth describe the experience of turning the exterior lights off as unlike any darkness they have encountered on the surface, a darkness with a physical quality, dense and pressing and absolute. The second quality is cold. The temperature at the bottom of the North Atlantic in the area where the Titanic rests is approximately 3 degrees Celsius, just above the freezing point of fresh water. The cold does not penetrate the submersible, but the monitors showing the exterior environment and the instruments reading the temperature convey it. The water outside the hull is at the threshold of freezing and has been at that temperature, approximately, for as long as the Titanic has been there. The third quality is silence. There is no current significant enough to move the debris field's objects. There is no weather. The occasional passage of a deep-sea organism makes no audible sound within the submersible. The ambient noise of the ocean, the constant low-frequency sound produced by distant weather and shipping that permeates shallower water, has been filtered out by 2.5 miles of water above. What remains is a silence of a kind unavailable anywhere on the surface of the earth. These are the conditions in which the Titanic has been resting since 2:20 in the morning of April 15th, 1912. The bow section rests at the north end of the debris field, its prow in the sediment, the forward deck facing slightly upward toward the surface above. The stern section rests to the south, approximately 2,000 feet away, heavily damaged and unrecognizable as the ship's stern, except by the context and the propeller shafts. Between them, across a mile of flat ocean floor, lie the contents of the ship, the possessions of 2,224 people, the equipment of a 1,000-room floating building, the materials of a crossing that lasted 4 days. The debris field has been largely undisturbed for the years between expeditions. The bacteria continue their work on the hull, The ecosystem of the floor continues its ordinary business, which has nothing to do with the ship, and which the ship has become part of through sheer physical presence. A deep-sea octopus has been photographed sheltering in the hull. A squat lobster has been filmed crossing the debris field. The sea anemones on the hull sway in imperceptible currents. What has not changed since 2:20 in the morning of April 15th, 1912, is the basic character of the place. It is dark, cold, and silent. The ship lies at the bottom of the sea where it fell, and the sea is doing what seas do with the things that fall into them, which is to receive them, alter them, and eventually incorporate them entirely. Robert Ballard, who found the ship in 1985 and returned in 1986 in a submersible to see what he had found, described the site in a way that has remained the most accurate short description of it: a quiet and peaceful place, and a fitting place for the remains of this greatest of sea tragedies to rest. He said he hoped it would remain that way. In the years since, the site has not remained entirely that way. Expeditions have removed objects, and the deterioration of the hull has continued beyond what Ballard would have wanted for the site. But the fundamental quality he identified, the darkness, and the silence, and the cold, and the stillness, has not changed. It will not change. The ocean floor is not a place that changes quickly. The ship that began as a keel plate on a slipway in Belfast in March 1909 is now a field of objects on a plain at the bottom of the North Atlantic, 100 years and more removed from the world that built it, being consumed slowly by organisms that had no existence before the ship provided them with a home. The bacteria named after it continue to work. The shoes remain. The next chapter is the last one, and it returns to the beginning. But before it does, it is worth staying here for a moment, in the quiet of the debris field, in the cold and the dark that have been the ship's permanent condition since the morning of April 15th, 1912, and letting the scale of what rests here come into focus. This is the largest moving object humans had ever built when it launched, held now in the darkest, coldest, most silent place on Earth, and the world above continues to build larger things, faster things, louder things, all of them eventually falling quiet, all of them eventually resting somewhere. The Titanic arrived at its rest in one night. It has been at rest ever since. The keel plate that was laid on Slipway 3 in Belfast on March 31st, 1909, is still there, somewhere in the bow section on the ocean floor, buried under sediment and encrusted with a century of bacterial growth, no longer recognizable as the single steel plate it once was, but still there, as matter, if not as form. The story that began with that plate has been running for 20 chapters tonight, and it has travelled a long way, from the Aral gantry rising above Queen's Island to the 3 million rivets driven by riveting gangs working in the Belfast cold, to the craftsmen who spent 10 months building 11 historical styles of room inside a bare steel hull, to the Turkish baths with their Arabic tile screens, and the Café Parisien with its trellis work and wicker chairs, to the grand staircase descending 6 decks under a glass dome, to the 709 third-class passengers who had sold furniture and borrowed money to buy their passage and who stood on the deck at Queenstown watching Ireland disappear, to John Coffey hiding in the mailbags and walking away from the ship at Queenstown while he still could, to Wallace Hartley with his violin strapped to his body, to Thomas Andrews with his notebook, to Frederick Fleet in the crow's nest without binoculars, watching the dark ahead, to the night of April 14, which was by every account among the most beautiful nights the North Atlantic had offered anyone in years, the stars brilliant and still, the sea flat and black and silent, and the ship moving through it at 22 knots with 2,224 people aboard, nearly all of them unaware that the calculation Thomas Andrews would soon be making with his notebook was already being written by the condition of the watertight compartments below. To the 705 people the Carpathia brought to New York on the morning of April 18th, to the 1,500 who were not among them, to the 73 years of silence on the ocean floor before the camera system aboard the Nore found a boiler on a monitor at 12 minutes before 1 in the morning of September 1st, 1985, and Ballard was woken by the cook and came to the control room and took his crew up to the open deck to stand in the wind and be quiet together. To the rusticals, to Halimonus Titanicae, named after the ship in a binomial designation that will persist in scientific literature after the last physical trace of the hull has been consumed. To the shoes still lying in pairs on the sediment of the debris field. To the Bible recovered from the floor, with its text still legible. To the menu from April 10th, 1912, the first meal served aboard. To the debris field now, at 12,500 feet, in darkness so complete that it has a physical quality, in cold just above the freezing point, in silence that has no equivalent on the surface of the earth. To the bow section, still pointing roughly northeast, the direction the ship was traveling when it sank, its prow in the sediment, the crow's nest above it still attached to the mast. To the sea anemones on the hull, and the crabs crossing the debris field, and the deep-sea fish that circle the lights of visiting submersibles and then return to the dark when the lights go away. The ship has been in this place for more than 100 years. It will be here for some decades more, growing gradually less recognizable as the bacteria continue their work and the structure continues its slow collapse, until what remains is not a ship, but an expanse of ocean floor that is different from the surrounding floor only in its chemistry, enriched by the iron that was once the hull of the largest moving object humans had ever built. That process is not melancholy once you settle into the scale of it. The ocean built the iron that built the ship, and it is taking the iron back through the intermediary of organisms that could not have existed without the ship to provide them with a home. The ship is being returned, molecule by molecule, to the place it came from. It has been doing this, quietly, for a very long time. If this channel has given you a way through the night, a long story told slowly enough to let the dark do its work around you, that is what it is here for. There are more stories where this one came from. Ships and cities and creatures and places, all of them told at this pace, all of them ending in the quiet. Come back. We will be here when the night finds you again. The Aral Gantry was demolished in 1969. The slipway where the Titanic was built is now a tourist attraction in the city of Belfast. On a clear day in the harbour, you can stand on the ground where the keel plate was laid and look out across the water where the hull entered the sea. The water still goes all the way to the bottom,